Welcome to Understanding the 2024 Updates to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework with James Tarala. If you have any questions during the presentation, please drop them into Zoom's Q&A feature for James to see. A copy of the slides and recording of the webcast will be available for viewing in about 24 hours and can be found on the webcast registration page. Please keep an eye on the Zoom chat throughout the presentation for any helpful links and information. We thank you for joining us today, and we'll begin momentarily. Thank you.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is James Tarala. I'm a senior faculty member here at the SANS Institute. And as Hayes just mentioned, today we wanted to be able to give a webcast on understanding the 2024 updates to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, also known as the NIST CSF version 2.0. Appreciate you being here on the webcast today. I know we've had a lot of you have had opportunities to take these webcasts with me and possibly maybe take courses with me in the past. I've been a SANS instructor for maybe going on a little over 20 years now. And most of my research has been in the area of risk assessment, cybersecurity standards, frameworks, understanding governance principles that organizations can put into place to help manage their cybersecurity programs. So what I want to talk about today is I want to talk a little bit more about the updates that happened here recently to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Now, I know this is something that's maybe a few months old. This has been a topic area that's been in place here for most of 2024, and a lot of people have been talking about this. And even 2023, we saw the draft updates come out on the suggestions of what they were going to publish. And then, of course, in the spring of 2024, they went ahead and actually published the standards themselves. And what I want to do today is just take a little bit of a deeper dive. I know most organizations have looked at the cybersecurity framework, and if we're just honest, probably a lot of us have looked at these through the lens of the wheel diagram that NIST always publishes. And a lot of us have probably seen to that depth that there's now a new category, a new function in that wheel. And I know a lot of people sort of stopped there, right, and stopped at their analysis. But what I want to do is I do want to take a little bit deeper dive today. I want people to be able to understand exactly what the differences are. And we're going to take some time to really sort of dig into the meat of this and try to understand what's going on here with this 2.0 update. Uh, as many of you have probably seen, and you've probably seen me do these webcasts and do this slide a few times. I've always really just wanted these webcasts to be conversations. I know there's a lot of us who are struggling to try to understand really specific things that we need to know to better do our jobs. And I want this to be that kind of conversation where we have a chance to interact on a topic, something that's interesting, something that we need possibly to make our jobs go smoother and actually help our companies achieve our goals. So hopefully we can make this kind of in the style of a fireside chat. We're going to present some information to you. We've got some data we want to present to you. The thing that I would say is as we go through the presentation, again, if you have questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A. I will do my best to get through some of those questions. I'll be honest, I probably won't get to most of them until we get to the very end. But if I happen to see something as I'm going through and it makes sense, I might try to address some of those as we go through the webcast. The other thing too that you'll see is if you go back to the previous slide, or if you go to the very end, the very last slide, I will give you my email address that you can use to go ahead and ask me questions. Again, if there's just things you're curious about or questions I don't get to during the course of the presentation. The first thing I want to do is I want to have a little bit of a history lesson for us. And I know a lot of us get bored on history, and we don't necessarily always want to understand the backstory of some of this stuff. But I want to give you more than just dates and stats and figures. I think there's really some interesting backstory here for us to consider. The thing I think sometimes we do when we look at these standards is we look at it in a vacuum, just as a document in its current state. And we don't go back in time and think about why did this thing get created to begin with? Because remember, these documents, these cybersecurity standards we're all dealing with, these are created by people. And those people existed and lived in a context, and they had biases and they had things in their mind when they were creating these documents. And so I think if we want to get into the mindset of the people who are writing these docs, we need to understand where they came from. And so I think that's one of the things we need to do if we're going to try to understand the CSF and 2.0. Well, let's just understand who is NIST to begin with. Let's understand what is their mandate. Why are they creating documents? Why would we even care? But let's start there, and then we'll dig into the details of the actual standard itself. One of the things is I was doing some research on NIST and their history. I actually found quotes going back to the 1700s where the US federal government recognized that they needed to be able to have standardization for the purpose of consistent economic commerce. And basically, the idea that if we don't have standardized weights and measures from an engineering standpoint, it turns out commerce can be really, really difficult. If you go to a gas station and you have a gallon of gas that equals one thing at gas station A, and you go to gas station B and you get more gas, or you go to gas station C and you get less gas, but the prices are relatively consistent, it makes it really difficult to understand what you're purchasing from a commerce standpoint if we don't have standardization. So I even found quotes back from John Quincy Adams, from George Washington, saying just the importance of, as a new nation, that we needed to be able to have standardization in terms of weights and measures. And for a very long time, what we found was that that really that was its main focus. Now it's funny, I'm actually looking at my slide and I see that I have a typo on this. It wasn't officially in 2022, it was actually officially in 2002. So please forgive me, and I'll fix that before we post this online. But officially in 2002, again, thank you for your awareness there. FISMA declared that NIST would be responsible for defining cybersecurity standards in addition to all these other things we're talking about. Now, so they basically got an extra mandate. Now, today, they still get their budget from the Department of Commerce. So commerce, standardization, weights and measures, those sort of things are still core to what NIST's mission is. And they still get their budget. They still report via US Department of Commerce. And that's where sort of they fit in the big picture of the US government. But in 2002, they basically took responsibility because of the Federal Information Systems Management Act of 2002, that the federal government needed somebody that they could go to figure out, well, what should we all be doing? And again, this being a standardization organization sort of made sense that they would take that responsibility as well. Now, there's a series of documents that they've then created to help towards that mission. The one that most of us are aware of course, are the NIST special publications, or the SP 800 series. That's the one that probably most people think about when they think cybersecurity and they think NIST, right? They think 800-53, they think 800-171 or 172, or some of those special publications. But they also have Federal Information Processing Standards, or FIPS standards. A lot of times you see encryption standards and different things like that in FIPS requirements. You have interagency reports, IRs, and you also have cybersecurity white papers, or CSWPs. So, and there's even some other areas of special publications outside the 800 series. So there's actually quite a few documents that are out there that NIST is responsible for maintaining. Now, the question I get a lot of times, even looking at this, people say, okay, James, that's great. But what if we're a global organization? Like, these all seem like US federal standards. Like, why should I care about this? Well, it turns out quite a few international governments that I've worked with actually point back to NIST. Because again, US taxpayers have paid for these standards, and they're pretty well just open standards. It's almost like an open scientific or research group, even though it's funded by the US government. And so just like the National Institute for Health publishes health information that people around the world use, NIST publishes cybersecurity information that people around the world use. So yes, it tends to be more popular in the US, and certainly there are countries around the world that don't love the US, and so might be a little loath to use their standards. But I've been countries in the Middle East, I've been the Nordic countries in Europe, I've been in places in Eastern Africa that all use the NIST standards as a part of their national cybersecurity strategy. So even though we tend to think of it as a US standard, there's actually a lot more to it than that. Well, in 2002, when NIST first got this mandate to produce cybersecurity standards, there's a whole bunch of these different standards that they were really responsible for looking at. There's a lot of different issues, right? Mostly safeguard centric that they were going to try to define. And if I just give a quick little history here of kind of what happened, in 2002, NIST became responsible for these standards. In 2005, the first version of a cybersecurity standards library, 853, was published. And many of you know, you may not love 853, but you know that it's been around for a long time. In 2014, the Cybersecurity Framework was first published in its 1.0 version. And in 2016, the first version of 800-171 was published. Now, all three of those standards, 53, the CSF, and 171, are all cybersecurity defensive standards. They're cybersecurity frameworks. They're basically this idea of what's a list of the good things that I should be doing to be able to defend myself. And 800-172 was published in 2021 as a way to augment 20 or 800-171. So again, you have these sort of all these documents that are in place. Now, version 1.1 of the CSF came out in 2017. And then in 2024, if we look at the spring this year, of course, we see the most recent version of the 2.0 version of the CSF. Now, there's literally hundreds of other cybersecurity documents that NIST has published over the years. These are just some of the big ones. But when we talk about cybersecurity frameworks, we talk about standards and, again, benchmarks for cybersecurity. These tend to be the ones from NIST that people are most focused on. Historically, 853 is sort of the grandfather of all standards, right? It's been around forever. It's probably one of the most detailed, definitely the longest standard that we have in place. But we also see these others, the CSF, 800-171, and others coming on the scene, definitely almost like stocks, right? They have different popularity in different years. And of course, this year, because the 2.0 version of the CSF was published, the NIST CSF has gotten a lot of attention here in 2024. Now, where did the CSF actually come from? So if you think back to that time, so again, if I just look really quickly back here at our list, so in 2014, what was the context? What was going on in 2014 that sort of necessitated the importance of this in place? Well, long story short, the world had 853. And I think a lot of you know, 853 is great. It's a really comprehensive library of standards, but it can be a little academic. And frankly, the list of safeguards in it is huge. Literally, there's thousands of things in there that you could possibly do to defend yourself. And in fact, we talked to Dr. Ron Ross, who helped lead that project and has for lots and lots of years. He would even tell you that 853's job is to tell you what are the good things you could do, not necessarily what are the good things you should do. And so again, something just kind of keep in mind there, it's not necessarily a prioritized list of here's the top so many things that maybe you'd want to consider. Well, in 2014, the Obama White House basically signed an executive order saying that they wanted NIST to create a cybersecurity framework. Now, the purpose of that framework was going to be to help protect critical infrastructure. And that was specifically the idea. Remember, when this was really commissioned via executive order, NIST already had 853. And so when the White House went to NIST and said, listen, we need this new cybersecurity standard, their initial response is what you would have expected. They said, well, okay, sure, but we already have 853. Why do we need something new? And so what they did was around that same time, there was this big push to say, we need to have more public-private partnerships between the US government and what's going on in private sector. And the thought process was the federal government has a certain amount of intelligence that they can share with the private sector and help them be more successful in cybersecurity. And the private tech companies also said, you know what, well, we have information that we might be able to provide the government, and maybe we can make their lives better. And so the theory was, well, what if we partnered together, share that information, and then use that to make good decisions on what safeguards made the most sense? Well, so NIST actually held a series of workshops. So they went around the country, went around the US, and held a series of different workshops so that the NIST and the federal government could engage the private sector to decide which safeguards really should be included in this new standard. And in the end, what they basically decided to do was they said, well, we're going to pull together the things that already exist. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go look at all the existing documentation that's out there, things like 853. Many of you know, I had the privilege of working and volunteering for the Center for Internet Security and the SANS Institute for a lot of years. The CIS Controls Project, I worked on that for maybe 12 or 13 years. So they pulled our information into the project. They pulled COBIT information, right? So control objectives for information related technologies, ISACA project. And they pulled some things from ISO 27002 into there. And in fact, if you look at especially that first version of the CSF, and the very near the table in the standard that shows the actual safeguards that they expect you to follow, they actually go through and indicate this is where we pulled it from. And it's interesting, Tony Sager, who worked with me over at Center for Security, who helps found that project, always made the comment. He said, most of these standards are simply copied and pasted from other existing standards. And basically, when NIST created the CSF, that's exactly what they did. Family or the domain number one that they defined about hardware asset inventory was domain number one in the CIS controls. Domain number two was software asset inventory. That was domain number two in the CIS controls. Right? They literally just did a lot of copying and pasting and moving ideas around, which is fine, right? And basically, they almost took like a state of the union to say, okay, what are the things that everybody is right now telling us to do anyways, and let's just reflect that in the CSF. Right? But remember, it was designed specifically for a very specific class of agencies and entities called critical infrastructure, which again, you can sort of look up on your own and see what that definition is in the US. Now, since 2014, there's been three versions that have been published of the CSF, right? So version 1, version 1.1, and version 2. However, if we look at the differences, and this is, I think, where we sort of dive into details here, start getting into some of the differences, at its heart, if we're just totally honest, there haven't been a ton of changes conceptually between the safeguards in version 1, version 1.1, and in version 2. Now, are there changes? Is the wording updated? Absolutely. We'll get into a ton of detail on that here in just a few minutes. But at the foundation of all of this, there's really only conceptually been minor changes to the CSF since it was originally published. Now, remember, that first version was based on public-private workshops, right? So it was that coordinated set of meetings that took place. Since then, there's been a committee at NIST, right, a small group of employees slash contractors who have basically been keeping that information up to date. So that original version came via workshop, right? So lots of people gave feedback, but even after they gave that feedback, right, there was this small committee of people over at NIST that actually made the decisions. And in fact, if you go to the NIST website, you can even do a quick Google search and find the names of the people who are doing that work today, who chairs that committee and those kinds of things. That's all public information you can go look up. But there's been people who have volunteered, and volunteers have given feedback to NIST, right? And they'll just sort of send comments in. Very similar, I know when we were at Center for Security, we had to create even a web app to process all of the different feedback we were getting, because frankly, we were getting just so much feedback coming in on those statements. And so NIST is the same way. So people will randomly provide feedback, and you might think, okay, well, who vets that feedback, or who decides if that feedback is valuable or not? Well, it's this committee of people at NIST, and they make the decision whether or not the feedback from the community is worth listening to, it's something they should pay attention to, or just something to ignore. Now, if we look at some of the differences there, and so let's get specifically into then what changed between each of these versions, because that's really the heart of why we're doing this webcast today. So I have to say, my research and where I've spent a lot of my time has been conceptually on issues like cybersecurity risk management, how to do risk assessments. Many of you know I've written some risk assessment and risk management classes for SANS and at Cyverity. In my professional life, that's basically what I do, right? I use these cybersecurity standards. We perform risk assessments of organizations based on these libraries. So I'll admit I'm kind of a geek when it comes to understanding some of these standards and kind of what they're all about, because I use them a lot in my everyday life. Well, when version 1 came out, we certainly all saw it and we processed it and we tried to understand it. And so, that happened. And then a couple of years later, version 1.1 came out. Now, when version 1.1 came out, of course, we were all excited. We said, okay, well, what's changed, right? What's new? And so me being sort of the policy or standard geek that I am, is I took all of the statements from version 1, and I took all the statements for version 1.1, and I put them into text files. And then what I did was I took those two text files and ran them through one of my diff programs. And because I wanted to see exactly from a text perspective what changed. And what I basically learned when I compared version 1 and version 1.1 was that there were some grammatical changes, which is to be expected, right? We always change our perspectives on language and find ways to improve. And it's funny, I always kind of make the joke that it feels like they changed their theory of commas between version 1 and 1.1, which is fine, right? That's what happens. So you see lots of comma changes. But in addition to that, you see really two big sections that they made a couple edits to. They added a couple statements on authentication, which it didn't really change the meaning, I don't think, of the underlying document itself. But they did sort of clarify and call out some more specific issues on authentication. You might think, okay, well, was it MFA or something detailed like that? And it was more generic than that, but they still just called out these statements. And then the second thing that they did was they went through and they clarified supply chain requirements. And so what they did was they said there's a lot of focus, if you remember back in 2018 when the new update came out, about things like counterfeited Cisco routers and supply chain attacks that were taking place in the federal government, not necessarily as much in the private sector at that point. That comes years later. But in the federal space, there's lots of examples of these supply chain attacks, and that became a bit of an issue. So they added a couple of statements about supply chain security, really what we'd probably call third-party risk management today, but they added a couple of those statements as well. But that was really it. Like those were really the changes between 1 and 1.1. So I think it's important to know that the changes took place. Definitely see some updates, but conceptually, were there really many updates between 1 and 1.1? Honestly, not really. You really just don't see many updates there. Now, what about up to version 2? Now, one of the biggest changes, if I can just talk sort of very high level, so we'll just talk high level for a second, then we'll get into some more specific details here. The major updates, though, going into version 2 is yes, there's grammatical changes, but the thing that I liked about it, what they did a really good job with it, and again, if I can just give them some kudos for some of the work that they did, is they took some of the language in version 1.1 and rewrote it to be more reflective of the words we actually use to describe these safeguards. Because it's almost like version 1 and 1.1 had a more academic feel to the way that the communication took place, but the language, the style felt more natural, felt more like what we actually talk about in cybersecurity today. So personally, I just appreciated that because it felt more like a natural standard, having read through the changes. So that's a big change I thought was useful. It felt more relevant, felt more practical. Yes, there's some grammatical changes too, but then the other big thing, and of course, the thing that everybody notices right off the bat when you're talking about version 2 is that now there's this new govern function that's in place in the wheel. And so if you look at the functions list, things have been reorganized around that new govern function. Of course, we're going to get into that in more detail here momentarily. The other thing I'll say is they did clarify safeguards in each category. So there's definitely some more introduction of that, more clarifications. For the most part, if you say, okay, James, are there big new requirements in version 2 that version 1 didn't talk about? And I'll point out a couple that we might consider big changes. But again, if I'm really just being honest, I feel like the changes from a requirement standpoint, like what are they actually asking us to do standpoint, I feel like the list of things really isn't that different. And so you say, James, well, wait, if there was hardly any changes between version 1 and version 1.1, and now you're saying that there's not really many changes between 1.1 and 2. So for the last 10 years, have there really been many changes conceptually between any of the versions of CSF? I'll be honest, my answer is no, not really. Again, there's been clarifying language, there's been cleanups, there's been reorganization with the govern function. But other than that, if you say, are there brand new big topics we have to consider in 2024 that weren't on our radar in 2014? My answer is really no, not so much. But let's give them credit. Let's dig into this at a deeper level and try to understand what this is all about. So the first big thing, right? So if I look at on the left, the CSF version 1.1, I look at the right, of course, that's the 2.0 version. You see these updates to the core framework functions, right? And that's what I said before. So you still have the main 5 areas on the outside, right? Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Those 5 items are still in place. So you still see that those are there. But now, of course, we see this govern ring. And of course, the thought process there in version 2 is that govern ring sort of influences all the safeguards you might put in place at the identify level, the protect level, the detect level, et cetera, et cetera. So you see that there was an extra yellow ring that's in place now. And what they did at a high level here, once we start digging into the actual details themselves, is they tried to simplify the number of safeguard requirements in version 2. And part of what they did was previously in version 1.1, they had all these different statements where you had governance-based statements in the protect section or governance-based sections in the detect section, et cetera, et cetera. And now what they've done is they've gone through and said, okay, let's take those individual governance statements out of each of the 5 functions that were currently in place in 1.1, and let's stick them all into this new govern section. So if you ask the question, were there governance statements in version 1.1? The answer is yes. And so they were there. It's just now, frankly, they're better organized in the 2.0 version. But again, is it asking you to do wholesale new things? I don't know that's necessarily the case. But do I like the new wheel and the way the new wheel is set up? Absolutely. In fact, I think the thing that I'll see probably more often or sort of used more than anything else as we go through and look at these functions is that, or out of the NIST CSF holistically, is this diagram is the thing you're going to see people use over and over again. And if anything good comes out of this document, frankly, it's going to be the discussions that people use around this. So I see people doing that all the time as far as actual functionality. I'd say this is probably the biggest thing that's going to come out of this new document. Now, again, you sort of see how this breaks down. And so this is going to be true whether we talk about version 1.1 or we talk about version 2. Still, conceptually, the framework or sort of the definition of terms is going to be pretty similar between each of these versions. So if we look here, right, we say we've got the functions, which are those things I just talked about over on the left. And it's funny, they're really consistent on their colors. And I've even seen in marketing documents, it's almost like we've created these new color patterns based on the things you see there on the left-hand side. Those functions and those function colors have almost become sort of emblematic now. Well, those areas then get broken down further into categories of safeguards. And then each of those categories of safeguards gets further broken down into subcategories of safeguards. And so what you'll see is we'll kind of break these down as we're going through and doing analysis and trying to understand what's changed. That'll be sort of how we see the breakdowns take place there. So we'll use those words again, functions, categories, and subcategories. Now, under all of these, remember, what we're doing is we're defining what we'll call safeguards, or what people oftentimes will refer to as controls. Both of them sort of are almost interchangeable in definition. The thought process here when we compare those is originally you heard a lot of people use the word controls, basically defining what are those good things we should be doing to achieve our objectives. But more and more NIST has been pushing people to use the word safeguards. And even when we were volunteering at Center for Homeland Security, NIST would approach us on a regular basis and say, well, the CIS controls thing, really it should be the CIS safeguards. Like, can't you like rename it? And well, they had invested so much branding in it at that point that we were already committed. But really you'll hear people use those terms interchangeably. But I've been trying to use NIST's words just to be consistent in my language. But all of these things you'll see defined here are really ways of just organizing individual specific safeguards, or again, these good things that we should be doing in our cybersecurity programs in order to help our cybersecurity programs achieve our objectives. Now, if we look at the safeguard, again, the functions and the categories, these are the safeguard functions and categories that we just see defined in version 1.1. Now, I'm not going to read through all this to you for you, but I wanted you to see this just as a reference. And so you can use this as a reference point going forward, just to have something to refer back to if you want to look at these webcast slides later. And of course, we'll provide a PDF of this too, so you guys can all see this more in that format as well. But you see then from there, again, I'll just do this quickly, but if you go to the 2.0 list, you'll see again, now that we have govern here, again, if we go back and forth a couple times, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap, right? Again, the function areas are the same with the exception of that govern section, but identify, protect, detect, et cetera, those are still in both documents. So you can see, again, these are the specific NIST categories, right? So this isn't me making these up or trying to define these for you. This is just what NIST says those words should be. So again, I'm not going to read through this library for you, but you can see what's there. Even though there are more categories, one of the things that NIST did between version 1.1 and version 2 is they actually deleted more safeguard statements than they added. And this has been a trend that I've seen in quite a few of the larger standards bodies that are out there. It's almost like they're moving towards simplification. We've seen this with the CIS controls going into version 8 and then later version 8.1. We've seen NIST with their 2.0 and a couple others as well, where you might sort of think to yourself, well, we want these cybersecurity standards to be comprehensive and broad and all encompassing and have lots of statements about all the things we should do. But if we're just honest, and I'll show you a comparative study here in just a few minutes, but really what we're finding is the trend is almost to shrink these so you have a smaller targeted list as opposed to them trying to tell you everything to do. So even though, so anecdotally, we might refer to these as comprehensive cybersecurity standards, like in the CSF, it's really not. Like if you again compare these safeguards in any version of CSF to say a broader set of good things that we all know we should be doing, there's definitely going to be areas where they're good and areas where they neglect, and we'll talk about that here momentarily. So again, if we kind of look at these and kind of do a little bit different comparison, I try to put these into like an ID, like into an Excel sheet, so you can sort of see how they sit side by side. Uh, Again, in theory, you can kind of see how these moved around a little bit. Basically, what I tried to do was if I looked at the version 1 categories and the version 2 categories, the green categories are the ones that basically stayed the same. Now, if you look at some of these, for example, like asset management, I mean, asset management is pretty much the same on both the left and the right hand side. But if you go through some of these, like if you look at anomalies and events versus adverse event analysis, I left them green, but the reality was, of course, that there was a little bit of difference in the naming, but for the most part, the topic was the same. So I still left that as a green, sort of a similarity between the two. But what you do see, though, is you see things like, especially the governance sections, where you see some of the biggest changes that take place there, right? We see things like originally we had in the identify section statements around business environment and governance, basically setting up a standard for how we're going to establish the context for the cybersecurity program. Well, then what they did, of course, is they created all of these new functions, the govern function itself. And now we've got these different sections that are there, and you can see those reflected. Also, again, so that governance or govern section, right, is of course sort of the big thing here. Previously, a lot of these statements were in place. And again, you'll see that a lot of these were included in the other areas, right? So again, it's not that the governance sections were just brand new, but what you saw was that there was this, now there's this dedicated function where all those governance statements can be put together. And I think that was a wise decision. I like what NIST did here as far as putting these things all in one place to help us understand what governed requests were going to be in place. There's a tendency I'm finding when we're building cybersecurity programs to put governance or management statements into like protect or detect conversations, which makes sense because you want to have governance of safeguards related to protection or related to detection. But at the same time, if I'm trying to go to an engineering team and say, here's all the things we need to detect threats against the environment, I don't want to necessarily put them responsible for governance. Like I want another group to handle that, the governance part, and I want my engineers who are doing my detection, I want them to focus just on that detection piece. So I like the fact that they've separated that. That way, again, I can give the governance safeguards to a governance team or my, in terms of the Institute of Internal Auditors, right? We could talk about this sort of as a second line activity. And then I can go to my first line folks and talk about protect controls or safeguards or detect safeguards or those kinds of things. So again, you see the reorganization makes total sense to me. But basically you think about, I always tell people to sort of imagine sometimes with these standards, like what they do is imagine you have this big list of standards or individual, let's say, statements that are in place. And imagine you then took a pair of scissors in that PDF of, say, the most recent version of the CSF, and you cut them into little pieces, and every safeguard is a little piece of paper. It's like what they did between version 1.1 and version 2 is they took the little pieces of paper, and some of them they threw away, and others they reorganized into sort of a new section, and then they pasted it all back together and created the new version of standard. That's kind of the best analogy I can give you when we're looking at this. Now, the new governance function is broken into new categories, right? So we now have these 5 categories, right? We have organizational context, the risk management strategy, roles, responsibilities, and authorities, policy, oversight, and then supply chain risk management. And each of these, when combined with safeguards in the other sections, right, the CSF, just reflect sort of good common safeguards for governance. Now, is it still a little academic? Does it still have sort of this Greatest hits vibe to it? Yeah, probably a little bit. Is this a checklist in this section of, what are all the things we need to do? I mean, there's probably a few gaps in there, but this is kind of a greatest hits kind of list. And that's sort of a good analogy I've described to people is if we look at this new governance section, you'll see that there's a lot of good statements in there. You should absolutely be doing those things. Are there possibly gaps of things you might want to add into that? Yeah, probably. But overall, though, is it a good list of good governance safeguards? Yeah, I'd say it's a good place to get started. But again, it's not designed to be comprehensive. It's designed to sort of focus on some of the more important things that they want you to think about. Now, specifically, I'll call out a couple statements that sort of jumped out to me as I was doing my diff analysis that I thought were relatively new clarifications. So let me sort of conceptually call these out. What you're going to find is I think a lot of these statements are, how would I say, nitpicky maybe a little bit, in the sense that they're not just these wholly new ideas. Like the first one on our list is supply chain thing. And it's not that supply chain wasn't considered back in version 1.1. It was, but I think what you're going to find is the things here are going to be just a little pickier that I call out because, again, I don't know that there's these brand new topics that version 2 is asking us to do, but there are detailed items in those topics that we probably need to consider. So, for example, under supply chain, they're going to ask you to make sure that they're prioritized by criticality, or said a different way, that they're inventoried and then prioritized by criticality. So again, just making sure that you have the ability to do sort of both sides of that. So do we have an inventory clearly? Again, are they known? And then also have we defined criticality values for each of those? Which I think if we talk third-party risk management, again, I don't think this is a brand new concept. I don't think this is a new idea by any means. However, I do think it's new to the CSF to call it out specifically. So that's one thing we'll call out. Also, you'll see there in supply chain, it says the plans will include provisions for activities that occur at the conclusion of a partnership or service agreement. Again, great call out. Again, this is something that wasn't called out in earlier versions. And it's something that, frankly, we see a lot of organizations not really having plans for. But it was interesting because both the Center for Net Security and CIS Controls version 8 and the NIST CSF, both about the same time, released this statement. They both added this to their list, which I thought was kind of interesting. And you can kind of see how these different groups play off each other. And you'll definitely see a lot of interaction if you're kind of looking at cybersecurity standards today. The NIST CSF 800-171 and the CIS controls, it is very clear that the authors, and again, I can behind the scenes, I can tell you, the people who are on the committees for those three documents are definitely well aware what the other groups are doing. And so statements like this, you'll see sometimes show up in unison across those, which is kind of an interesting example. Also, you'll see here under governance that operational or organizational leadership is responsible and accountable for risk and fosters a culture that's risk aware, ethical, and continually improving. So again, just saying leadership is responsible. This is also a sort of a trend you're seeing in standards like the new New York NYDFS requirements, for example. They also are sort of calling out this idea of leadership accountability. So again, you see that called out here in the CSF as well. Also looking at in the oversight section, saying that risk management performance is measured and reviewed to adjust strategic direction. So again, using risk management and safeguard selection, safeguard validation to adjust direction and strategic approaches. In other words, what are the programs that an organization puts in place based on the selection and validation of safeguards that might be in that environment? So again, but again, all the other things in that governance section, in my opinion, were relatively, I won't say repeats, but relatively reflective of the earlier version. So again, but these are just some call outs, I'd say, that I thought were kind of interesting and unique that maybe were a little bit new in this version. In the identify section, a couple that would call out specifically, data inventories. Okay, so that's something that was new. So they're asking you now to do an inventory of data. Again, funny story. CIS controls version 8 and 8.1 also made this a big issue. So again, data inventory is reflected here in the new statements. And then also a statement here in the ID section about cyber threat intelligence from information sharing associations, ISACs, those kinds of groups. They're also encouraging that sort of behavior, which again, sort of goes in line with the public-private partnership theory and backstory that was at the heart of the original version of the CSF to begin with. So again, both of those are called out specifically. Also in the protect section, this is where, again, I didn't, especially in the protect section, I didn't see a lot of really big changes. And if there's anything I would have hoped to see new changes for, new requirements for, it would have been in the protect section. I think that's what a lot of us are really probably most concerned about. Frankly, SANS has always had a bit of a backstory of engineers and people trying to stop these attacks from being realized. So it's been kind of a focus of ours. So you always want to see more meat in this section, probably more so than even some of the others. But they did call us a couple things. The one I want to get a little excited about is a PRPS 05 statement. I'm not saying they're saying this. I'm going to try to read into it. But many of you know, for me, I've been a big believer in application control as a defense for a lot of years, based on some of the incident handling work that we had done years ago, and just some of the observations we've made of incidents that we were a part of. Clearly, we believe that application control as a defense is a really big, effective capability that a lot of us could use that we don't take enough advantage of. So there's a statement now in PSO5 that says that installation and execution of unauthorized software is prevented. Now, one could argue this is limiting admin rights. One could argue this is EDR. One could argue this is application control. I would love to say this says application control, but I know I'm reading into it when I say that. So I'll let you take away from that what you want. But that statement is relatively new and cleaned up from the previous version. So, take that how you want. And I'll go to Alex's question here that he posted in the Q&A. He said, how well is the CSF 2.0 protected against some of these hacker attacks? How likely do we see that CSF is actually specifically going after some of those technical defenses? You know, if it were me today, I think the CSF is trying to provide an overview of running a cybersecurity program. And there are some examples of good things you can do technically to defend yourself, but it is not primarily a technical document. If you're looking for specific technical recommendations, I think probably the CIS controls is going to be a little bit more on that line of thinking, or even more so. What I recommend people check out is the Australian government. They have their ACSC Essential 8 document. That's much more in line with technical defenses than what you're seeing in the CSF. I think CSF is trying to put its foot on both sides of the fence and have one foot in governance and program management and another foot in defense. But the problem is they just sort of skim the surface of both. So that's the danger of being a comprehensive standard. But to Alex's question, are there good technical things here? Absolutely. Can it stop attacks? I mean, sure. Is it comprehensive? I mean, it's trying to do a little bit of both, and I think you're going to see that there are some gaps when we show the analysis here in a second. You'll also see that there's some points here on secure software development. Again, just sort of emphasizing that as a point, again, a little bit new in version 2. In the detect respond safeguards, you'll see we have statements here on looking at the impact and scope of events. Also, cyber threat intelligence, right, is integrated into the analysis. We already talked about that in the governance section, but they emphasize it again here. And then criteria for incident recovery being applied. Again, just some detailed statements there that are new. Now, so then one of the things that we did is we've been running a study since about 2020, 2021. When the pandemic hit, we had started wanting to do analysis of the standards themselves and show how do these standards relate to each other. I was going to have dinner one night with John Strand from Black Hills Information Security. Many of you know, was the SANS instructor and such. And we were going to go out for dinner one night. And while I was waiting for him to finish up his class, I heard him say in class to his students that, listen, if you want to defend yourself against these attacks you're talking about in class, pick a cybersecurity framework. They're basically all the same. Just pick one, just go with it, and you'll be fine. And as John left class, I pulled him aside and I said, John, I don't know if that's actually true. I said, I feel like there are some pretty big differences between these standards. And so we talked about it over dinner and while we were walking to grab a bite. And we both kind of agreed, yeah, we don't really have details or anything about this, but we have this vibe that, yeah, there's probably are differences between these. We just no one's really done any in-depth research. So we took it upon ourselves to build a database of these standards. And, I'm up to like maybe 60 or 70 standards. There's an organization that I volunteer with now called the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation. And we've got, we've got a number of different free resources that are out there. It's crfsecure.org, and I'll give you some other things here in just a minute. But one of the things is we built this database where we put all the different cybersecurity standards in them and then mapped them against a common library of safeguards. And then one of the things that we did is we built a web app that would actually go through and show the comparison of a given standard against that benchmark. And so the thought process being is that if we take basically this aggregate library of all the safeguards that are out there, almost like an 853 approach, right? But looking at all these good things that all the standards are asking you to do, then what if we take an individual standard and compare it against that list? We can see sort of where it emphasizes what statements, where pros and cons and such would be. So if I look in the web app that we built, and you can see just an example of that here, you can see the NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 1.1. You can see kind of where it prioritizes. Obviously that big bar in the middle is third-party risk management. You can see some other areas there like vulnerability management, log management, et cetera, that they do a decent number of safeguards around. But then there's others like privileged account management or mobile device management or perimeter network management, where there's really no statements at all. And so, but it kind of helps you see that there are, from a scoping standpoint, just differences in place. And if I do that for the version 2, you'll see that there are some differences there as well, right? So again, there's more emphasis on third-party risk management, more emphasis on log management and such, but there's still a fair amount of other areas that really aren't addressed at all. So again, mobile device management, not a single statement. Email management, no statements at all. Very few statements on perimeter network security, privileged account management, privacy, right? So again, the idea here is just we wanted to be able to give people sort of just an objective way to look at each of these standards. It doesn't mean that this is a good or a bad standard. It just means if I look at each of these domains, I look at on the left-hand side, and then I do count values where I map this against that common library, which is what we've done in our database, then you can see where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are. Now, that doesn't mean that their scope should be, say, privacy. Maybe they say to themselves, you know what, we don't want to cover privacy, and that's totally fair. And so, but then you wouldn't expect privacy to be addressed. But if you're trying to use the CSF as a privacy framework, well, obviously that's going to be problematic, right? Because we just don't see a lot of safeguards in privacy in this document. So we wanted you to be able to see those comparatives. And so we created that web app to help sort of show, what the comparison would be. And I just wanted you to be able to see the results of that here. A couple other things you do. So beyond just the safeguard lists themselves, they do mention safeguard tiers to try to help define maturity levels for each safeguard areas. These are meant to help an organization define how mature they are at each safeguard. It is not about prioritizing the safeguards. To be clear, the CSF has a little over 100 statements in version 2. They don't say these statements are higher priority than these other statements. They use tiers to talk about how well you're doing implementing each of those, but they don't actually say do these first and then these others. That's not their focus. So again, just kind of keep that in mind as you're going through this. In fact, most standards don't. There's only a couple of safeguard libraries that do. The CIS controls, 853, the CRF safeguards would be examples of some of them that do prioritize safeguards, but the CSF is not one of them. They also have these community profiles. So again, if we look at the community profiles for version 1.1, you can see on the left some of those profiles that are in place. There have been, again, these are some community resources that are there, commercial slash, private sector profiles, for example. And then in 2.0, you've got a couple in there as well. But again, you just don't see a lot. So the Cyber Risk Institute, right, is yet another one of these cybersecurity groups that are out there, sort of private sector groups. They've taken they've taken the NIST CSF and they've added to it. And they've tried to create a profile specifically for the financial services community. The thought process, of course, is that just beware the rigor that goes behind the safeguards in the profiles is much different than what goes into the CSF itself. But what they tend to do is, whereas a CSF might have, like, let's say 100-ish statements, it's just over 100 actually. But then the CRI profile, for example, would at least double that of going into more depth for each of those. So again, it's okay, but what it's trying to do is address the gaps that they feel that the CSF has. So it's almost like you're reading their interpretation and sort of the things they would add when you're looking at the community profiles. So just kind of keep in mind what that is. Now, for some of you too, I know we're going to kind of run out of time here too. I just wanted to leave with some practical advice. So I mentioned one of the groups that I work with is a group called the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation. We've been releasing tools to be a part of um, the assessment world, the risk assessment world, to try to help the community out with some of the tooling that we have in place. And so one of the things that we've done is, for years, many of you know that for a lot of years, we had a website called auditscripts.com that we used to just give away free resources for SANS students and other people in the community. We've actually rolled that up now into the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation. So just to kind of keep it all streamlined and make the resources a little easier to get to. But we're continuing to give away additional tools to help organizations sort of measure themselves against some of these standards. The CSF, of course, being one of those standards that's there. We have these Excel-based tools that we give away to organizations. A lot of people use these to measure themselves. And actually, recently, we also put together for members over at CRF, we have a web interface as well to help organizations sort of keep track of this more in a database-oriented format. So some tools if you are finding yourself wanting to assess yourself against these. And we also have some related to the CRF safeguards for the same thing. Again, this is just one of those free resources that we make available on that site to help organizations that are trying to implement these. If you do want to measure yourself against these standards, see how you're doing, look for gaps, those sort of things, these might be some tools that you want to consider. But again, just some tooling out there to kind of help with that. The reality, though, is we can talk all day academically about the differences between the CSF version 1.1 or version 1.0 versus 2.0, and that's all fine. At the end of the day, though, what the thing that I guess from as an action item standpoint, I'd like you to consider is I'd like you to consider that the reality is that the importance of these safeguard libraries is that they can be inputs into our process of deciding which safeguards we think actually need to be in place. Now, are these the only safeguards we want to put into place? Probably not. There's probably other things we want to put in place as well, but they're at least a list of things we should consider. And so I think a lot of us are probably, even if we don't necessarily adopt just the CSF as our only standard, which I would argue probably most people don't, but it at least gives you a list of safeguards that you can say to yourself, you know what? I want to be aware of these. I want to be influenced by these. I want to consider these as part of my strategy. It may not comprehensively be my whole strategy. I want to consider these for sure. So consider using these resources, use the CSF as part of your comprehensive strategy. Use that to create a baseline of safeguards that you're going to use as your long-term plan. You should have a target state. And rather than chasing, every version of every standard that just might possibly come out, my encouragement to you would be make your standard an aggregate of all the safeguard libraries that you think should be brought in together. And if you don't want to make your own, again, I've talked about the CRF safeguards, which that's exactly what that is, right? It's that aggregate library. If you want to use that, that's fine too. But come up with an aggregate target state where you say to yourself, this is what I'm going after. These are the things I believe I should be doing to be successful. And then use that as a foundation for the risk assessments that you do of yourself to identify where are the safeguards that are missing in our environment? Where do we need to spend more time? Now, other research you might put into place, if you do want to learn a little bit more about those comparative studies between cybersecurity standards in general, back in September, I think it was, I gave the most recent version of my cybersecurity standards scorecard webcast. It's a webcast I do once a year. It tells you a little bit more about the backstory of how we've done our comparative studies between standards. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, I know there's links for that on YouTube and other places. You want to listen to that webcast at some point too. Also, of course, I'm teaching SANS courses. We have two new classes. One's a 2-day course on performing cybersecurity risk assessments. And we have a 5-day course now that I'm very excited just sold out here in Seattle. So I'm very excited that some of these classes are getting an opportunity to run. I know we have a new one coming up in Europe, I think in a few weeks as well. So again, the 2-day and a 5-day class, if you want learn a little bit more, obviously we're going to go into some more depth on some of these topics as well. Other books, I always, again, you got some holiday seasons coming up. If you want to spend some time, have some quiet time, want to read a little, a couple books I might recommend. Douglas Hubbard's books are always great to read in this topic. I don't always agree with everything that Hubbard says, but there's a couple things, especially in that first book he wrote, that I really think conceptually make a lot of sense, and I think are worth us considering as we're building our governance programs here for cyber. And the other one I've been interested in here, it's not a cybersecurity book per se, but it's definitely a risk book. primarily talking about risk in financial markets, but actually I think there's a lot of really good relevant topics. Fooled by Randomness by Nassim Taleb. Um, Interesting book, meaty, if you want to sort of dive into this topic, really almost philosophical as it relates to risk. Definitely might be worth your consideration if you've got a little time. And I always like to, again, kind of leave with my email address as well as a resource. Because frankly, we want to be able to help you all in this journey. That's why we've always been doing these webcasts. That's why we have SANS courses. We just want to be able to sort of provide this kind of feedback to the community. So again, I've been giving away my email for a lot of years, and frankly, students have never really abused me. So I'm sure you guys won't either. So again, you've got that there if you've got an additional resource. Um, a couple of things, Julie. I've got just a few minutes left here before to sign off, and I do see we have a couple questions. Let me just see if I can answer maybe a couple of these. Um, we've got in here. Let's see. So we have someone who writes in and says they're sort of the sole practitioner doing cybersecurity for an organization. They're trying to start and put a program in place. What would you do if you're sort of a solo practitioner in this space? It's interesting. We've been having a lot of conversations about this lately, especially for smaller organizations. Here's the thing that I would guess I would do at a very, very high level: get agreement from your organization that this is important. Go to ownership, go to leadership of the organization and say, listen, I know I'm here to do cyber, but let's all agree this is something that we should at least be pursuing. And what I would probably do if it were me is I would probably start with a self-assessment. Those tools I showed you, you can go to the crfsecure.org website. There's some free downloads there. You can grab those, but grab one of those self-assessment sheets, assess yourself, and bring that data back to leadership. Show them where your gaps are. Show them how good you're doing, and make that and something that you're going to do once a year. And whether you're a sole practitioner or a larger organization, I think annually doing something like that is good to get sort of a pulse on where you are. Granted, I'm biased, professionally, I know that's what I do, but I think there's value in doing that though, because it gives us a state of the union. It helps us understand where things are. And then you can share that data with leadership and they can use that data to make better decisions. And if you use the CR safeguard list, again, that spreadsheet that I mentioned, that's one of those that I mentioned, there's also priorities in there. And not to make it overly simplistic, but then what I would do is take a look at all of the gaps you have in level one issues, the foundational issues, and do your best to address those gaps. Don't try to overly complicate it. Focus on the things that matter. Make progress over time. You're not going to run this marathon, in a year. It's going to take you some time, but chip away at it, and eventually you'll get there. So again, just at a high level, probably that'd be my best response. So the other question here is: there's been a lot of work on preventive, identifying, and incident response, and that question comes up. Will there be additional standards for recovery and restoration of functions? It's interesting. There's definitely a lot of focus on resilience these days. So I feel like you are going to see more conversations around those topics. I'm seeing some European Union standards come out on this here in the last couple of years. Some other research, again, really resilience focused that way. I don't see NIST pushing hard in that area. I mean, obviously they've got a couple sections of the CSF that talk about it, but there haven't been wholesale changes to either of those. So will there be more conversations about it going forward in the future? Probably, but at least for the short term, I don't see anything on NIST's radar to really make that a holistic priority more so than they've done up to this point. So, that's one of those things we'll have to keep an eye on. And let's see. And yeah, and I would say just maybe one last question, and then we'll have to unfortunately wrap up for the day. Is this standard really focused on some of those areas of forensics, incident response, and some of those attacks? Not really. Does it mean those are important? No. And these are absolutely important things we need to keep in mind, and absolutely we should be prioritizing. But does the new version of CSF really give, say, detailed guidance on forensics or threat hunting or any of these topics? Reality is no. It's not really been its focus. You can obviously tell from the new version, governance and program management is sort of more leaning towards that focus. And I would imagine that will continue into the future. Again, just kind of running out of time today, but if you have other questions, again, you've got my email. I was happy to sort of interact with you all offline. But thanks for being here. I'm glad you could be a part of the presentation today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And again, you can use this information, hopefully practically, to create strategies for your organization going home. Yeah, and thanks for being here. And hopefully we'll see you on a future SANS webcast.